Okay, we're actually recording. So before we begin, I do want to go over just introductions and things like that. As I said before, you can use the chat feature or the question and answer, and can always interrupt me. And so I any questions that you have. If you use the chat feature, you do have an option to just email panelists, not email, chat myself or Shannon and the panelists, or you can chat to all panelists and attendees. So you do have that option to make it more public. We are going to be going over today some of the resources that we put in our guide last week about resilience, resistance, and rescue. So we're going to start off with rescue and resistance during the Holocaust, and then talk about resistance during slavery, and end for A is for activism, for getting your students just some opportunities that they can be engaged in. There are two main goals that we have for this webinar today. One is to provide you, the educators, just with some background information about different types of resistance, and then two, some tangible ways that you can adapt these resources to your classes in however you're teaching. So based off of the information that I got from you all who signed up, was that about 60% of you are doing independent asynchronous online work. 20% of you are doing live meetings with your students, and about 20% of you are doing offline independent learning with your students. And about 2/3 are planning between 15 and 45-minute lessons. So that's the information that we have from you, and we'll be kind of looking at adaptations throughout. But if at any point throughout this this time here, if you have an idea for how to adapt, please feel free to share it in the chat, because we are not the beholders of knowledge who know everything. We definitely like to hear your voices and learn how you're doing it in the classroom. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you so we can move on. Okay, and then I need to make this bigger. Slideshow, play from start. Okay. And then I just want to see where the chats are coming up. One chat. All right. Jennifer, yes, you cannot see any of the other participants. So part of the webinar is that you'll just see myself or Shannon. So you'll only be able to see my view. Thanks, Shannon. Okay, so if you can just give a yes, if you can see my screen now, it should be resilience, resistance, and rescue, just my PowerPoint screen. So if you want to give like a thumbs up or just type, yes, I can see it in the webinar, that would be good. So I know what you're all seeing. It's interesting to see it from this perspective. Okay, Shannon says it looks pretty good. All right, so essential questions, no thumbs up option. That's okay. All right, as long as you can see it. The essential questions that we'll be going over today are: in what ways do people create in and out groups, and what happens to the ways in which a society defines we and they in the midst of times of uncertainty, chaos, and violence. So all the resources that we're trying to create are looking at how can we kind of better understand also what's going on today. So when we look at uncertainty and chaos, we're in unprecedented times at the moment. So how are we creating in and out groups? How are we making that connection with history to now? What factors contribute to the opportunities people have to participate in resistance or rescue? Consider age, geography, socioeconomic status, skin tone, language, ability, ethnicity, religion, national ideology. I feel like we can go on forever. But one of the things that we really want to get across is that we want students to be thinking about how people resist and what opportunities are available, because it is very, very, very easy to victim blame. And so we want students to be thinking more critically about how people have resisted, why they chose those methods, and how did their context contribute to it? And then finally, in what ways do people who participate in resistance and rescue efforts display resilience? So those are just some of the essential questions that we're going to be dealing with. How it will work so I can see you all throughout today. Next up, I just really briefly want to touch on some guidelines. So the USHMM has multiple guidelines that have been taken for teaching about the Holocaust. And so as we kind of look into resistance and rescue and resilience, here are some of the ones that I think are really important to keep in mind as you are talking about this with your students. One, define the terms, because I can tell you out of all the times that we've done our workshops, people have drastically different ideas of what resistance are and what rescue are. So making sure that everybody's on the same page, or seeing how narrow their scope is or how broad their understanding of these words are. We have a link in our guide this week, just to get you started, that you can share with students of how to define these terms. Avoid comparisons of pain. This is one that is so critical. And so we want to prevent any Olympics of suffering and making it seem like somebody's experience is better or worse than another's. And so this is really important to keep in mind, especially as we look at bringing in other examples of resistance across history into the same conversation. So today, when we're talking about the Holocaust and people who were enslaved, we do not want to compare those two to say, well, which group had it worse? That's not going to lead to any sort of productive conversation. Rather, we want to have responsible comparisons. So when we talk about contextualizing history, really taking into account factors that contributed to the success or failure. So again, that second essential question, when you were looking at geography or skin tone or age, those are really productive comparisons that people can make to understand when, how, why resistance and rescue efforts were successful or not. We do not want to romanticize history. Especially during the Holocaust, resistance and rescue was not the norm, and we do not want our students leaving thinking that everybody resisted or rescued and that this is the main story. This was the exception. So please take that into account. If this is your first time introducing the Holocaust to your students or any type of resistance to your students, make sure that you give them a little bit of background, at least, to the oppression or the atrocities that happened, so that they understand why people are resisting. Strive for precision of language. So we want to, again, recognize that resistance can have a broader definition than active and armed resistance, which is where most students seem to go right off the bat. They don't necessarily think about the creative or the spiritual resistance. So keeping that in mind, that when you're talking about resistance, at the end, we want their eyes to be more, we want their eyes to be opened up. Also, I know that this is about resistance and rescue, but we need to talk about perpetrators and not talking about perpetrators as inhuman monsters. So when we dehumanize perpetrators and call them monsters, it does nothing but separate the perpetrators from being actual humans. And so we'll get more into that later on, but it's something that's really important to avoid this dichotomy of good or bad. People are complex, life is messy. It is not just one or the other. There is lots of gray area. And so we want students leaving more confused about human behavior, because they're gonna self-reflect on themselves. And then make responsible methodological choices. It's really easy to place students and be like, well, what would you do in this situation? Or write a letter as if you were this person. Please do not do that. We don't know or especially I, but even you might not know what type of trauma students are going through, and to place them in a situation where they have to pretend where they're the resistors or they're the rescuers or they're the ones needing to be rescued is not a place where we want to be at the moment. We are not there to support the students as we normally are. So be really careful about asking what they should, how students think about this topic. Okay. So for those of you who have been to the museum, this is our reason why we study the Holocaust. I substituted the word Holocaust for the word history because we're talking about resilience, resistance, and rescue more broadly. So we study history to study ourselves, to examine our responsibility in an interconnected world where injustice persists on a grand scale. We study history to examine our connections to each other. I bring this up at the very beginning of every single workshop, and now this, because there are two great answers that I've gotten when I ask study the Holocaust, both from 6th grade students. The I just said before, of knowing not to distance ourselves, we study history so we can self-reflect on ourselves and better understand human behavior. The second person, or the second student had said, so we understand how the past influences and impacts the present. And so not thinking about history as this finite period of time where something starts and ends, but rather as something that has a lasting impact throughout time. And what do we do with that now? So I just like to throw that out there just to give you something to think about. Like I said in the beginning, the first thing you want to do is define. So this is, right now we're going to get into our rescue and resistance during the Holocaust workshop, and this is the first slide that we always have students talk about. So what I'm going to do now is we'll go through our rescue and resistance Holocaust workshop, and then at the end I'll go over ways that you can adapt the workshop to potentially fit your remote learning plan. And again, if you have any ideas, suggestions, or questions, please feel free to put it in the chat or in a Q&A to Shannon. But when you start off with, how do you define resistance and rescue, and how do you tell the difference between the two? You know, I'll give you what students often tell us, that resistance is fighting back. Always the first answer we get, it's fighting back. It's this active movement of fighting. And no one really thinks about that creative or spiritual resistance. Rescue is somebody else helping somebody get out of a dangerous situation. So those are the two most common responses. But the last two questions, what factors contribute to people choosing to resist or rescue, or people not resisting or rescuing, is really where like a lot of students tend to think more deeper. So those are really interesting ones for students to kind of come back and forth about. If you are doing independent asynchronous work, these are really easy journal prompts that you can just have students respond to and send back to you, or talk about with a family member, things like that. If you're doing a live session, then obviously you can just open it up and have students work on the chat. Or if you're doing a Zoom meeting, they can speak to each other. If you're doing asynchronous online work, Google Docs is really easy. You can have the students respond to these questions and then comment on each other's, so that they're having some sort of interaction, even though it might not be at the same time. So if you leave this up for 24 hours and they have to go and respond to somebody else's or comment on somebody else's, I know when I was in grad school, that's the way that my classes were online, is you had to post something and then you had to comment on 2 other people's. So you can really use that comment feature in Google to create this sense of interactiveness. We do have tools of resistance at the museum that we use, and so I mention these here now because this is a really good opportunity for students to, sorry, my pages got messed up. For students to explore which one of these tools are being used in the examples that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and which ones were most effective given the circumstances. So create, celebrate, persist, protest, organize, and reform. If they can think about these not only historically, but again, will end in the present, using these six for activism, they can see how resistance is this long fight that many people throughout different histories, including now, are partaking in. So we do like to kind of put this out there, as these are concrete ways that students can think about resistance rather than this big word. You can create as resistance, celebrate as resistance. And those are things that really come to students' forethought when they're looking at resistance. Universal obligation, by far one of our favorite activities. If people want in the chat, have they ever used this with their students before? And if so, what was your experience with it? So I'll just wait a couple seconds to see how people respond to that. Oh, Jennifer, you and your sister are gonna love this. All right, so I have done this lesson. Rob said sometimes the answers are disturbing, but it's a great activity to make them think. I totally agree. I've done this lesson with 4th grade all the way up through college, and it is amazing the answers that you get. Sometimes 4th graders, you just like, wow, that is super insightful. Oh, and June's using it this week. I'm looking forward to their responses. June, I'm interested to hear how you're using it with your students. Are you having them just journal on their own and then get it back, or are they doing any conversations with each other? So essentially what you do, we took this lesson from Facing History and Ourselves. So this is in the guide. What we do at the museum is we provide about 9 or 10 roles have students put that we have students use to classify. So essentially you put me in the middle, the words me or your name in the middle, and then you have to choose where you place in this circle. So circle 2 is people who care so much anything to help. Circle 3 is less than circle 2, circle 4 less than circle 3. And so some of the roles that we give out are parents or guardians, siblings, mayor, principal. Don't do teacher from year. That's one thing that we've learned, because you never feel about them. You can do a mail carrier, bus driver, we always include a famous person. You can do pets. So it's interesting to see where they place certain people. And so here are some of the most insightful comments that I've gotten, because what you really want to talk to students about with this is, how did they determine where they placed each person? I don't care who you placed in what circle. So again, going back to 4th grade, who, you know, when I was doing it with students, you can tell who had a really bad morning with their sibling based on this activity, because they placed a sibling in circle 4 or they placed them in circle 2. So it's kind of funny at that point where you're like, oh, some people think it's a game when you're younger, but when you're older, they do tend to think a lot about who they place. So I don't ask for specific names, because I also don't want to be responsible for a fight between best friends that they're like, I put you in my circle 2, you're in circle 3, how could you do that? So I kind of put more roles in there instead to keep it broader. But how did they choose who they put in circle 2 versus circle 3 versus circle 4? Loyalty comes up a lot. How long you've known the person for. How close they are to you. Shannon, I'm trying to think of what all the other ones are. What they've done for you in the past.
How often you see them.
How
Yeah,
often
like your daily interaction, because a lot of the times they'll say, like when we did have teacher from last year, if they were still in the same school and they saw them, they were likely to be closer to them, but like their bus driver or somebody that they don't see anymore. So daily interaction will for sure come up with your students.
Yeah, so it's really interesting just to get them thinking about it. And like June was said, this is so relevant right now as we think about the not only the people in our family, but our community and then our nation, that we're thinking about these layers of who we are responsible for. I had some students place, one, she was in high school, placed murderers, anybody who murders outside of the circle. So when you place somebody outside of the circle, I interpret that as that you think that this person or this group of people do not deserve to survive. They do not deserve to be rescued and sacrifice, essentially. And so when she said all murderers, I said, let's talk about that for a second. I was like, are all murderers bad people? And then, she got to think, she was like, well, no, not all. So digging that little bit deeper, being like, okay, well, not all murderers. And then we talk about, well, should everybody be judged based off of the worst thing that they do? Are people capable of change? Should we recognize that change? And so those are really interesting. And then I had another student who totally just rejected the premise of this activity, and it was great, and like erased the circles throughout the lines, erased the lines throughout the circles and said everybody deserves to be saved throughout their life. And so for him, there were no circles. It was just like everybody deserves this. So you'll get a broad range of responses. Then just to take it to the next level, we ask the questions, how, when, and why would people shift into different circles? So the example that students will, or some of the reasons that students come up with, again, is proximity. Is it right in front of you? Do you have no choice but to step in? So is somebody getting beaten up, or is it safe for you to step in? And did somebody do something to you? So thinking about that loyalty aspect, Shannon, what are some other things that people said about when, how, and why people have shifted circles? You've gotten to know them better.
Yeah, I mean, so for the younger students, it's always what's happening right in front of them. So the example that I usually use is, especially for people that are like, well, I'm not big enough or I'm not mature enough to rescue, is like, oh, if somebody trips and falls on the street in front of you, would you maybe help them up? So making sure that you can understand the human interaction on a base level. But for some of the other reasons, like some people just naturally feel compelled to rescue, and some will never feel that feeling. So it's like getting them to understand their own feelings too. So I think that proximity and then actions leading up to it. Yeah. So this is where.
Yeah. And so.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, these are just like the types of questions that you want students thinking about. And then how does a resistor circle differ than a perpetrator circle? So thinking about those roles of perpetrators and resistors, and I'll get into that with the lesson. So adaptations, obviously you can always have students kind of like answer these questions by themselves and self-reflect, or again, comment and share on those last three questions of how, when, and why do people shift? Do they agree, disagree? You can have students do this with their families and see how their family members agree or disagree with them. But again, talking about the broader community right now, I think this lesson is so impactful for getting people to think beyond themselves and what is their responsibility to our greater community or our greater nation. So then the bulk of our workshop deals with different examples of rescue and resistance during the Holocaust. And I'm just gonna go over just a few little things for each one because we've grouped them together, and then I'll go over how we adapt them. So Le Chambon and Denmark, we've kind of grouped together as places that have come together as a whole to resist or rescue. So here we can really look at the geography the leader in the community. So in these examples, it is the religious leadership, and that just general community responsibility. So when we look back at this universe of obligation, we can see that, I'm going to take Denmark, for example, that the Jews in Denmark before this time period were individuals. They all had individual names. And then as Denmark was occupied and the Jews became more endangered, they were not necessarily thought of as individuals anymore. They became grouped together as Jews, Danish Jews, and then these Danish Jews moved from different circles of being individuals to circle 2 within the Danish community because they needed to be rescued. And so you can see how circumstances change the responsibility that we have to help other people. Heinrich Ross and Oneg Shabbat for creative resistance. I love looking at these two because, again, these are 2 examples of Jewish resistance from different ghettos. So Oneg Shabbat looking at the Warsaw Ghetto, and Heinrich Ross looking at the Lodz Ghetto. So these are the 2 largest ghettos, Warsaw being the actual largest, and then Lodz being the 2nd largest, but also lasting the longest. And what type of resistance was available to people within the ghetto. And so here we have Oneg Shabbat, who, under the leadership of Emanuel Ringelblum, gathered writings, statistics, artwork, photographs, objects of daily life, totaling over 35,000 pages. And so that's really, really impressive. And it really talks about the individuals in the photograph. So again, when we think about the dehumanization of Jews during this time, these archives allow these people to be individuals and retain themselves, which is such a source of resistance. Then you have Heinrich Ross, who took photographs within the Lodz Ghetto. And if you came to our museum last fall, we did have his photographs up in the museum. And he ended up being, he worked for the Department of Statistics in the Lodz Ghetto, so he had access to taking photographs ghetto. And so when we look at creative resistance, really thinking of the questions, why in a time of such struggle would people devote precious energy and resources to creating? And so how does this type of resistance challenge what your students might have thought about before? So the White Rose and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Here we're looking at the White Rose, looking at youth who took action, and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is again looking at Jewish resistance. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, if we go back for a second, Oneg Shabbat happened in the Warsaw Ghetto, and so did the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. 2 very, very different types of resistance within the same ghetto. So you're seeing that difference of how people react even within the same place. So unfortunately, both of these types of resistance ultimately ended up in death for many of these people. So these 3 people from the White Rose were all found guilty and beheaded. And obviously many of the people that were part of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising were captured and killed. But we also get to think about the effect that their actions have on other people. So for the White Rose, the copies of their leaflets that they created, and they ended up creating 4 leaflets, were spread throughout, were brought to the neutral countries, and then dropped over countries. So their message was still spread. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, when you hear about other Jews resisting, it inevitably has this effect on other Jews being like, oh my gosh, other people are resisting, and it boosts their morale. So there's these longer term effects beyond the people that are involved in the resistance. Individuals in action. So I use individuals lightly because these people still had to collaborate with others, but Marion Pritchard ended up being part of this like rescue movement where she helped hide people, she helped get documents for people. And one night there was a Dutch policeman and some Nazi officers that came to the house. She was able to hide everybody safely. They left, they didn't find anybody. And then the Dutch policeman came back soon after because they learned that if you come back soon after, people that were hiding thought they were safe and they'll come out. Mary Richard ended up killing that Dutch policeman so she could safely hide the people that she was helping. And then we have the diplomats. So the example that we have here, because there were many diplomats, was Shiun Sugihara, who was a Japanese consul in Lithuania and ended up helping over 3,000 people with transit visas through Japan. He was told specifically to not give visas to people who did not have the right documents, and he clearly did it anyway. He ended up losing his job and pension as a result. So looking at the sacrifices that individuals make or what people could do with power. Diplomats had so much power, and there were obviously not many of them that took that power to help other people, but then what are the consequences of helping? And our last one is resistance in Auschwitz. So here we have two examples of individuals. Les Aigner is a local Holocaust survivor, and then Primo Levi is a renowned writer. But both of them had very different ways to resist within the same place. So you can look at other examples of individuals in concentration camps, in ghettos, in a variety of different places, but we chose just to do it specifically in Auschwitz. So Les Aigner has a fork and knife that we have in the exhibition at the museum. And when I first met him, I asked him about this fork and knife. And he, while he was in Auschwitz, he worked in the kitchen and he found the knife in the mud one day. And so he hid that knife in his wooden clog. And when he had extra bread, he would use the knife to cut the bread into equal slices. And to him, that was retaining his sense of humanity in a place that was designed to dehumanize him. And Primo Levi writes, there's an excerpt that we have taken where he says, so we must certainly wash our faces without soap in dirty water and dry ourselves on our jackets. We must polish our shoes, not because the regulation states it, but for dignity and propriety. We must walk erect without dragging our feet, not in homage to Prussian discipline, but to remain alive and not to begin to die. So we look at persistence with these two people and ways that they found to individually resist to find hope and inspiration and dignity. So those are a bunch of examples that we have at the museum. Usually at the workshop, we go into two in depth and we have them answer some of the questions to consider that we've included in the worksheets. But for your purposes here, for your remote learning, here are just some ways that we've thought about ways that you could adapt it for yours. So you can choose one person or one example from each category and have the students answer the questions to consider. So there's 3 questions that students can answer per reading. The readings are on average 1 to 2 pages. So you can choose, again, that's a total of 5 to 10 pages of reading with 15 questions. However long you take that to do with your students, that is an option. You can always extend that by having them think about resistance more broadly and how their views after reading some of these examples have changed. On the last page of this resource, we've created extension resources. So there are a lot of videos or books that are available that that are supplemental to a lot of the things. So I found one today, literally 10 minutes ago, or not 10 minutes ago, 10 minutes before we started. Museum Houston has a 5-minute video about the diplomats. And right, literally 5 minutes before we started, I got an email from USHMM, and there was one of the survivors. It was a 3-minute video clip of one of the survivors talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So you can use these extension resources and focus on one in depth, if you just with the understanding that students know that this is only one example of resistance and that there were a spectrum of examples. If you are having the class meet together online, you can split them up into groups, have them meet in groups, summarize and present the rest of the group one of the examples. Or you can, again, have them look at one of these people and do a research project on one of them. So those are just a few of the examples that you can do to adapt depending on if you want this to be a 1-day lesson or a 1-week lesson. We did not include this next part in examples or as a way to do this with your students, but I do want to include it with you because this is how we end the workshop, is confusing people. It is our job to have people leave with more questions than answers. And so we choose one person. We have 2 examples, so I'm actually going to do Carol Stachak with you, but we, as humans, we really want to categorize people as easily as possible. So we have these roles of perpetrator, bystander, collaborator, and rescue and resistor. And we so want to just be like, you are a perpetrator or you are a resistor, and that is the end of who you are. And life is so much more complicated than that. And Carol Stachak is a great example. So the information that you see on the screen is what I give students to reflect on at first, and I have them choose an example and they have to go stand. So this is like the game 4 corners that I used to play in elementary school. And so this is kind of a take on that. So this is the example. Obviously, when you look at this, most of the students go to perpetrator, and then I give the rest, because when we're teaching in class, we often condense stories because we don't have the time to get into the nuance. And so the other half of this story is that Carol Stachak was actually part of the resistance as well, the underground, and he was hiding a Jew in his own house during this time. And so he ended up being found out that he was working with the underground, and he himself was hanged. So we look at Carol Stachak and we're like, but wait, you were killing Jews while simultaneously rescuing them. That's confusing. And so that's something that we really want students to grapple with is, is thinking about the complexity of human behavior and how people aren't good or bad. They're in the gray a lot of the time. So those are examples for rescue and resistance during the Holocaust, keeping an eye on time. I do want to just talk quickly about how the enslaved resisted. So I found an awesome example from the Zinn Education Project. I highly recommend that you sign up. It's free, that you can get this resource, but it gives examples of 7 different themes that people who were enslaved in the US resisted. And so they have, in the examples that they give, they have students do this mixer activity where everybody's getting up and walking around and talking to one another. My suggestion for you is to pick one of the examples, because for each group, there's six excerpts, like there's 6 quotes or 6 examples. So pick 1 or 2 of those for your students, have them read. There's this great mixer worksheet that goes along with it. Really, really easy. And then again, it makes the students think more in depth about, I never thought about, saying your name in your culture as resistance. Or I never thought about women standing up during enslavement, or women going out and trying to visit their families so close to maintain this family connection as an example of resistance. So I loved this because it so talked about the power that enslaved people had to resist. This doesn't mean that, like, if they didn't resist, it's their fault. Far from that. But I liked how they framed it as what power did people have to resist? Because I think putting power into the people who were enslaved is a very different narrative than we often hear. So I really, really liked that. And one of the guiding questions that I urge you to consider with your students in this one is, what do we do with the histories we inherit? That's one of the things that we're at our museum with the exhibition Southern we inherit. Slavery legally ended, but again, when we go back to the great student that said, how does history impact and influence the present? This is a great lesson and resource to really start to tackle that question. So these are just the other ones. So this one is kind of more active resistance with running away, fights, and revolting. And we look at group 7 at the revolt, knowing that sometimes resistance isn't successful in the terms of, like, they revolted and they're free, because most of these people were executed as part of their revolt. But that doesn't mean that they didn't resist, and that doesn't mean it wasn't successful. So redefining what success is. Let me just look at my notes for a second. If you're doing this and you're doing a live synchronous, I love the idea of doing a jigsaw with them. So you split your class into 7 different Zoom rooms, have them talk, and then have them go back to their base groups, where you again put them into different Zoom rooms and they discuss these answers together. So they're teaching each other. But again, otherwise, you can choose 1 or 2 examples for your students to use and answer the questions that were created along with the lesson. And then I want to end with our A's for activism. So you can also find this on the remote learning resources page, but these are just some ways students can think about activism right here, right now, in the moment. And so as we go back to those 6 tools of resistance, they can create a social justice playlist. I know one of the schools that came to the museum earlier in the year, they were having their students do this, and I was like, that's brilliant, I'm stealing that. So I love this idea of really paying attention to music and listening to the lyrics that people are talking about. What injustice are they raising awareness about? How are they using this medium to reach different people who might not? Celebrate a religious, cultural, or family recipe and explain what it represents. So sometimes celebration, obviously, when we look at the Holocaust and people needed to celebrate their religious holidays within the ghettos or within a variety of different places, even the enslaved people, how did they celebrate with their music? Family recipes and food is such a great way to celebrate. So have your students share that with your class, and this way everybody can learn about somebody else's religion, culture, family, importance, something like that. To keep focused when life gets hard. I mean, right now, it's hard. Life is hard right now. So on a remote learning resources page, you have a diaries guide where we provided, Shannon, what was it like? I think 25 prompts that respond to right now, just to have them help them process what's going on in the moment.
Yeah, and they range in accessibility too. So the journal prompts, like all 25 won't be for all of your students, but they range in accessibility from 6th grade up to high school.
Yeah, and I know that we do have a couple of elementary teachers on here, so journaling doesn't have to mean writing. They can draw what to do and like talk to their parent or talk to somebody else and have them write down what they're saying. Protest by making a flyer and explaining what the issue you are protesting is, ooh, sorry for that typo, why it is important to you, and the change you wish to see. So there's lots of stuff that people are passionate about. I have to tell my docents all the time that like youth are really passionate and knowledgeable about a lot of different things. So encouraging them to make a protest poster is just an easy way where they can snap a picture, share it on Instagram or something like that. Organize and share a group that has come together during a time of crisis to support a community or cause. I mean, if we look around us now, there are so many examples to choose from. So thinking about why are they supporting that community or cause at this moment. And then reform and write email or call your local and state representatives about the issues that they'd like to see addressed. Students underestimate, and I think adults too underestimate, the power that youth has in influencing reform. When I talk about the Holocaust and genocide bill that we have in Oregon, one of the reasons that it came to fruition is because a young girl contacted her state representative. Local survivors have been trying to get a bill passed since the 90s. And so when you have a young person getting involved and caring, that was the impetus for making it happen right here, right now. So they have so much power in government that they don't realize. And just because you can't vote doesn't mean that you don't have the power to make a change. So I really urge the reform aspect, especially if you have older students, to have them really think about how their voice matters, even if their vote doesn't at the moment. We will be doing a voting rights week in a couple of weeks as our Oregon primary comes up. So be on the lookout for that. But at this time, that's kind of what we have going. Those are some of our resources. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them and we can answer them. If not, I want to thank you so much for joining. To receive your professional development credits, thank you. Thank you myself. This is what I'm just remembering. To receive your PDUs, we will be sending you an email with a survey. So if you could fill out the survey and then we will send you your PDUs. So note that once we get your survey results, we'll then email you your professional development unit. But I hope that you found some of this helpful. We'll be doing another webinar next Monday at 3:30 p.m. We're gonna experiment with time a little bit. And so this week's theme that we're doing is art through and in response to loss, hardship, and oppression. So be sure to join us next week where we go through some resources for that. Thank you for your kind comments.